So then, let's kick off. The session I've called non-fiction translation, the limits of the literary, the limits of translatability. That's quite a grandiose kind of title. It indicates, though, a couple of the main themes for this session. As I mentioned just before, we can be quite flexible. I've some plans for the session, but I don't mind if we go off-piste in a variety of ways, so long as we're discussing. My name then is Duncan Large, and I'm Professor of European Literature and Translation at the University of East Anglia in Norwich. And I also run the British Centre for Literary Translation. And so I wear a number of hats, and it was through one of the projects that BCLT is involved with, one of the international projects, the Petra E project, and then network, and attached to that, the European School of Literary Translation. That I've got to know Dutch colleagues who are in Utrecht at the Taal Unie, Gea Schelhaas, Carlijn Bartelman, and other colleagues. And so I've been working with Dutch colleagues for a number of years now, and was delighted then to be invited to take part in this session. As a translator then, Anna already mentioned it, I've worked from German and French. So these are works that I've myself translated, and they're all philosophical works, and you can see there's a bit of a red thread here. They're all either by or to do with Nietzsche, the German philosopher. So that's where I'm coming from as a translator. The first book I did, quite a lot of years ago now, early 90s, was the first one there, Sarah Kaufmann's Nietzsche and Metaphor. So that was a book-length translation from the French. That was the first book that I did. And that came out of my research interests at the time in Nietzsche. I was working as a PhD student, working on a PhD, which then came out later on Nietzsche and Proust. A glutton for punishment, I certainly was. But I've continued with my research interest in Nietzsche, and that involves writing kind of academic books about Nietzsche, but also continuing to translate Nietzsche. So the next book-length translation, Twilight of the Idols, that was 1998, and then Ecce Homo 2007, both for World's Classics. So those are my book-length translations, but I've also, particularly more recently, I've been editing translations. So a couple of more significant editing projects here that I've been involved in. At the top, this is an ongoing multi-volume English translation of Nietzsche's works. We're aiming for 19 volumes altogether, and we're about halfway through that, and that's from Stanford University Press, and I've been working on that for just over 10 years. More recently, the other project on this slide, Routledge Studies in Literary Translation. This is a more recent series, which is in fact just started up. So there's a first volume coming out next year, and it's a series that I'm co-editing with Jacob Blakesley at University of Leeds. The Petra E Network I mentioned already. This is, and you can perhaps recognize some familiar faces here. This was the group photo. Now then, we took this, yes, this was in Salamanca at the end of 2017. And you can perhaps see there Carlijn Waterman in the front row, and Desiree Schinks in the background, and Henri Blumen as well. So the Petra E Network has been one of the real highlights, I think, of my recent years at BCLT. And I want to, it's really with my hat on as a as a translator and researcher in the field of philosophy translation, and in my more kind of, if you like, administrative side, and my work for the Petra E Network. Those are the main hats, if you like, that I'm wearing in today's session. And I brought in to the topics we're going to be discussing the Petra E Network and some more general issues around not just philosophy translation, but non-fiction translation more broadly. A final publication then to mention just at the opening here, another relevant publication which I'll be bringing in at the end of the session is some work that I've done on the notion of untranslatability. And that was a volume that I edited with some current and former PhD students in Norwich that came out of, in fact, a PhD symposium on the issue of untranslatability. So that's a question which I've been exercised by for a number of years now, and I think that's a question that we could profitably think about in this session as well, largely because it in the theoretical discussion, it's often claimed that there's something about non-fiction translation which makes the question of untranslatability particularly relevant. So I want to focus on that question towards the end of the session, and the question of whether, in fact, this is a shibboleth. Is this something which is an area of concern specifically for non-fiction translators or not? Mm-hmm. So here's the plan of the session. So after our initial introductions, I've got an icebreaker where I'm asking you, what are we even talking about here when we're focusing on non-fiction translation? And then I've got 3 questions about non-fiction translation. Is it a separate category of translation? Is it perhaps a subcategory of literary translation? Is it somewhere between literary translation and non-literary translation? Is it? It's certainly in a kind of middle ground, but does that make it a separate category? If so, what special competencies might it require? So I hope that we can draw on your experience of the rest of the week so far, and your reflections more generally on this category of non-fiction translation, and specifically then, is it a separate category? Is it different from other forms of translation? In order to think about that question, I hope we can bring in the Petra E framework. Now, I understand that you've already had a look at this and kindly sent me some chat from your discussions around the Petra E framework. And my understanding is that you've been thinking about, so you filled in the interactive framework. We're thinking about where you fit in on the grid, and which is great, because I hope in thinking about that second question, I'd like us to think about it from the point of view of non-fiction translation, and I'm not sure that you've done that specifically so far. And so my question there is, well, this Petra E framework, which we've been very interested in developing over recent years, is it fit for non-fiction purpose? There's not much mention of non-fiction literary translation in this framework, so ought it to be tweaked? And then thirdly, if we have time, I'd like to come on to the notion of untranslatability. Is it specific to non-fiction? Is it even a useful concept? Is it a meaningful concept? And if it is meaningful, is it then specific to, say, translating philosophy versus translating poetry? So, okay, now then, yes, can you again see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Good. So some initial considerations then around this question. I've given you a distinction at the top, which was made by the very prominent American translation theorist Lawrence Venuti when he took part in the European School of Literary Translation that I mentioned a couple of years ago. And he raised this fundamental question kind of quite early in the discussion. The event was called the European School of Literary Translation, and so he raised the question, well, what definition of literary translation are you using here? And he made this distinction between what he called belletristic literary translation and what he called humanistic literary translation. And I thought that was a really useful distinction. What we might call then a distinction between literary translation defined narrowly and something broader, what he's calling humanistic literary translation, and which I would imagine, although we can come on to discuss this, would include at least most of the categories of non-fiction translation that we've already been throwing up. So I've given you also, by way of initial considerations, a quote from Chantal Wright, who is a graduate of University of East Anglia, I'm very pleased to say, and she teaches now at the University of Warwick in the UK. And it's a quotation from her book, simply called Literary Translation, that came out from Routledge in 2016. And she says this in giving her definition of literary translation at the beginning of the book: my definition of a literary text is wide-ranging and encompasses fiction, poetry, children's literature, life writing, philosophical writing, and Freud's psychoanalytic writings. So she's operating in a book called Literary Translation. She's encompassing not just, if you like, the usual suspects, namely literary fiction, poetry. She doesn't mention drama, but that's the kind of the classic trilogy, isn't it, of literary translation. She's already, in her definition here, broadening that to include children's literature, life writing, philosophical writings, and Freud's psychoanalytic writings, and those are examples that she goes on to use in her book. And then she continues, the quality of literariness is not dependent upon a lack of propositional or truth-bearing content. Let's just pause there for a moment. The quality of literariness is not dependent upon a lack of propositional or truth-bearing content, by which I take her to mean then that if you look at something like philosophical writing or Freud's psychoanalytic writings, they can be literary too. So propositional or truth-bearing content does not rule out literariness. This is a false opposition. You can have literary non-fiction just as you can have literary fiction. So that's Chantal Wright, and she's arguing for a very broad definition of literary translation, and suggesting that there's a quality of literariness which is shared then by the usual suspects, drama, poetry, and prose fiction, but also what one might call the broader humanistic literary category that Venuti was describing, which would include then forms of non-fiction translation as well. So that's quite a broad definition of literary translation. I think what's an interesting follow-on from that is an allied question about, well, depending on how you describe literary translation, that's quite an academic point in one sense, whether you call non-fiction translation literary or not. But I think what then is more interesting, if you move on to the more practical question, which is, well, should one approach non-fiction translation then in a different way? Does it call upon us as its translators to translate differently? Does it call on a different skill set? So that's perhaps another way of thinking about this, do you, if you're generally working with literary texts, do you need to retrain? Is this a training issue? Do you need to, is there a different methodology involved in translating non-fiction compared with fictional texts? And I know some of the sessions you're doing on this course involve, well, different kinds of reference works that you might be using and so on. But of course, all translators use reference works of one kind or another. So is there a difference of degree or a difference of kind between the work you do as a translator of non-fiction and other kinds? I've got some other quotations now for you on this point. Oops. Let's just, yes, come on to a quotation from Clifford Landers, literary translation, A Practical Guide. And he's suggesting that actually there's no significant difference between translating narrative fiction and translating non-fiction. All that has been said about translating narrative fiction applies, he says, to translating non-fiction. The same issue of the author-translator-reader relationship, the same sensitivity to nuance, the same sense of dedication. There are no uniquely non-fictional translation skills, he says. While not every translator of non-fiction can make the switch to translation of novels and short stories, it's a safe bet that almost every translator of fiction has at some time translated non-fiction. In its way, translation of non-fiction can be viewed as a subset of translation of fiction, minus some of the more vexatious elements, he says. It's an interesting qualification. So Clifford Landers then saying, well, there's no significant difference between translating non-fiction and translating narrative fiction. And I've got one other quotation before I kind of throw it open to you for a more general discussion. I've got a quotation from Katie Derbyshire, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with. She's a very well established and prize-winning, well-regarded translator from German. And this was a blog post of hers that I'm quoting here. A non-fiction translator, she says, needs to get the right register and thoroughly understand the original, has to either know about or research the field in question, and particularly its terminology, and must be familiar with the traditions and expectations around non-fiction writing in their target language. While you could say fiction translators do that too, non-fiction translators do it all to a much greater extent. So she's kind of drilling down there, isn't she, and saying non-fiction translator needs to thoroughly understand the original, yes, know or research the field in question, particularly its terminology, and must be familiar with traditions and expectations around the genre of non-fiction writing in the target language. So she's saying that those are things that fiction translators do too, but non-fiction translators, she says, do it all to a much greater extent. Just on this general point about the recognition for non-fiction translation, let me revisit those slides. I'll just share my screen again briefly and go back to the things that I skipped. Let's bring those in here. Really, it was just some slides thinking about how well recognized non-fiction translation is at the moment not just in the world of translation into English, but I don't know if you are familiar as a group with the Aurora Borealis Prize for outstanding translation of non-fiction literature. This is the is anyone familiar with that prize already? No. Okay. Let's go back to that. Sorry. Okay. Can you see the screen there? This is a prize from the International Federation of Translators, so FIT, the Fédération Internationale, and they have a prize, the Aurora Borealis Prize, for, as you can see, outstanding translation of non-fiction literature. and perhaps if you can just read the rubric, it's designed to promote the translation of non-fiction literature, improve the quality thereof, and draw attention to the role of translation in bringing the peoples of the world closer together in terms of culture. I'm actually one of the judges of the prize. The last winner was 2017. It was to have been awarded this last year, but because of coronavirus, it's been postponed. But look out for the Aurora Borealis Prize. That's a relatively recent addition to the FEAT Prize prize portfolio. So there's that out there, and they're interested in translation between. They don't specify language pair. On the other hand, yes, there's the this is specifically a program interested in German translation into English. So Geisteswissenschaften International, which you may be familiar with. That's a funding program that works in the humanities and social sciences, supporting innovative work by financing their translation into English. That's another relatively recent initiative. So there are things out there. I don't know, are there prizes in Dutch which are for Dutch translation which specifically focus on non-fiction translation? I'm seeing shaking of heads. Okay, maybe that's something that we can press for, but it's good that there are some prizes out there, both international prizes and for specific translation pairs. By way of a contrast, I wanted to show you the UK Chartered Institute of Linguists Diploma in Translation. What kinds of examination you can take for the Chartered Institute of Linguists, and they have quite a rigid distinction between their semi-specialized text types, and so they allow you to take separate papers in technology, in business, and in literature, and then on the other hand in science, social science, and law. So that's quite an interesting subcategorization, because it means that you can't take the diploma in any one year in more than one category within each unit. So science and social science, in other words, here is set apart from literature. And if you drill down in what they mean by literature, it's well, interestingly, fiction, drama, and film scripts. They don't include poetry in their categories for this purpose, for the diploma in translation. So they have really quite a narrow definition of what literature should be. But anyway, let's come back to our broader discussion. Yes, good. Are there any other responses to those quotations, and thinking about the specific skill set which might be required by the non-fiction translator? Those of you who had your hand up before saying, well, it is a distinct category, can I perhaps invite you to think along these lines? Were you thinking about a specific skill set then, or were you thinking about other considerations, perhaps the relation to the reader or relations to publishers? Were you thinking about how, as a translator, you need to go about translating non-fiction or not? That it's a good point when you say texts which have lots of endnotes. That partly depends on the text type, doesn't it? But partly depends on the publisher as well. Whether, for example, in certain kinds of life writing, whether you're allowed footnotes at all. It might well depend on the publisher whether they allow you footnotes or not. But even when they don't, in a sense, it's almost more necessary to do your homework, isn't it? Because you then have to it's just the translation itself which bears out the the research that you've done. And I'm reminded there actually of a fictional example, or rather a poetic example, and that's the relatively recent translation by Clive James of Dante. And that's, I mean, there's a really interesting introduction that he has to his translation there, because, so it's a very poetic text, but of course, usually with Dante, editions come with loads of footnotes and lots of research into who are the Guelphs and the Ghibellines and all that kind of stuff about 13th century Florence and so on. And he set himself as a translator the task of not having a single footnote, not including any of this kind of explanation as in paratexts, but to include it only in the translation itself. And of course, that's a possible translation strategy, but it requires really quite a lot of you, a lot more of you as a translator to weave in your explanations, if you like, and perhaps it requires more from the publisher and from the reader to be comfortable with that strategy. Just thinking about the philosophy translations that I've done, there's very often terminology is the crux, really, isn't it? If you're translating, I don't know, a work of Hegel or something, then there's a whole system of philosophy there which you need to plug into. So often then there's even where you might not suspect it, there's terminology at work. I mean, very often, of course, terminology might be some of the easiest parts of a text like that to translate, because there are established precedents, there are established equivalents which you just kind of slot in, and you don't really have to think so much about them. But just thinking of my own experience translating Nietzsche, he's a relatively technical philosopher. He's a very literary philosopher. It's another way of thinking about it. But there are some technical terms even in a writer like him, even in a philosopher like him. So you just have to be aware that, when he says, well, obviously there are well-known ones like Übermensch, the overman or Superman, and in fact, practice has varied there over the decades in which it's preferred in English, but there are even some relatively innocuous phrases like "great politics" is actually a very technical term in Nietzsche and so on. So being able to spot technical terms in this kind of writing is already one issue, isn't it? Perhaps we could finish off though by just coming on to that question and discuss this briefly around the notion of untranslatability, because that's something which has it's been raised particularly then with regard to philosophy, but more generally with regard to non-fiction. I'll just come back to the last slides in my PowerPoint on this. So yeah, I did a book on untranslatability, and my own contribution was looking at more philosophical discussions of this issue. And you may or may not be familiar with a particular contribution to the philosophical debate in recent years, and that's this. It was a book edited by Barbara Cassin, who is a French academic and translator, and it first came out in French in 2004 as Vocabulaire européen des philosophies, so European philosophical vocabulary, and then translated a decade later as, surprisingly perhaps, Dictionary of Untranslatables. The English title is the subtitle in the French, and they just flipped it. And they gave greater prominence then to this notion of untranslatability. Now, of course, it's a paradox in itself to have a translation of a book about untranslatability. And you can't see from these cover images, but it's a huge book, actually. I won't heave it off my shelf, but it's a huge book anyway. And it's really set the agenda for discussions around this theme within philosophy, the philosophy of translation, the translation of philosophy, because of this notion of untranslatability and the claim, historical claim, going back easily 200 years, that there's something particularly untranslatable about philosophical terms. So we touched on terminology before in thinking about what's specific to non-fiction translation, and Cassin has a whole very big encyclopedia, a dictionary of untranslatables, by which she means European philosophical concepts. And you might think, well, that's paradoxical. And her very definition of untranslatability is paradoxical, because she says this: l'intraduisible, c'est plutôt ce qu'on ne cesse pas de, and in brackets, ne pas traduire. This is taken from her introduction to this volume, and in the English translation, it's the untranslatable is rather what one keeps on, in brackets, not translating. I think it's a really interesting quotation, and it's suggesting then that the notion of untranslatability is a kind of spur to the translator, that there's never going to be any definitive translation possible. And this is particularly with regard to non-fiction translation, with regard to philosophical concepts. But for Cassin, the notion of untranslatability, it's not a sort of, oh, we throw up our hands and say, gosh, that's untranslatable, I don't know why I'm bothering, it's not possible. But to say, well, no, look, we're pragmatic as translators, we do translate, we translate even things that we might imagine are untranslatable. The untranslatable, she says, is what one keeps on translating or not translating, what one keeps on, in other words, trying to translate. And I wonder whether that speaks to your experience. In conclusion then, well, I hope that airing these issues has been of interest and has been perhaps helpful to you in thinking about what you're doing when you, if you like, wear that hat as a non-fiction translator, or where you're squaring up to a text which you might want to categorize as a non-fiction text. And perhaps just inviting you then to think, and beyond this session as well, about ways in which you perhaps might do that differently from translating other kinds of text, or ways in which not.